I told you there's a plant that outperforms tomatoes in almost every way imaginable, produces food year-round, stores for up to 6 months without refrigeration, never needs replanting, survives neglect, drought, poor soil, and yet almost nobody grows it because the food system quietly trained you to ignore it. A plant so productive that one small patch can replace an entire garden bed of tomatoes. A plant that doesn't rot in days, doesn't split, doesn't demand perfect weather, and doesn't trap you in the endless cycle of seed buying, planting, staking, pruning, fertilizing, spraying, harvesting, and replanting every single season. A plant that gives and keeps giving while tomatoes exhaust you, drain your time, and lock you into dependency. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what this plant is, why it quietly beats tomatoes for real food security, and why once you start growing it, you'll never look at your garden the same way again. Welcome back, and if you're new here, this is where we talk about plants that actually matter, the ones that produce under real conditions, not Instagram conditions, the crops that don't just look good, but feed you when things get expensive, unpredictable, or unstable. And if you're returning, you already know that when a plant quietly disappears from mainstream gardening advice, there's usually a reason, because the system doesn't reward permanence. It rewards repeat purchases, seasonal dependence, and fragile crops that keep you coming back every year. Now let's talk about tomatoes for a second, because tomatoes are the perfect example of how we've been trained to confuse popularity with effectiveness. Tomatoes are everywhere. They're romanticized. They're pushed on beginners. They dominate seed catalogs, YouTube channels, gardening blogs. But they are one of the most demanding, failure-prone, high-maintenance crops you can grow. They crack, they rot, they get blight, they attract pests, they demand staking, pruning, perfect timing, and even then they only produce for a short window before collapsing. And when they're gone, they're gone. You don't store tomatoes for months without processing. You don't harvest tomatoes in winter. And you certainly don't rely on tomatoes for food security. They're a luxury crop disguised as a staple. Now compare that to the plant nobody talks about. The plant that produces edible yields almost continuously, stores naturally, regrows from the same root year after year, and doesn't care if you forget about it for a week or two. I'm talking about the humble but unstoppable sweet potato vine. Not just the tuber you buy in the store, but the entire plant. Because this is where the real secret begins. Sweet potatoes are not an annual crop like tomatoes. They're a perennial system disguised as a seasonal vegetable. Once established, they regenerate from slips, vines, and tubers without replanting from seed. You plant once and harvest indefinitely if you understand how it actually works. And here's what no one tells you. The leaves are edible, highly nutritious, and can be harvested continuously without killing the plant. Meaning, while tomatoes give you fruit for a few weeks and then die, sweet potatoes give you greens week after week, month after month, while still growing tubers underground. That's 2 harvests from one plant at the same time, and the storage alone puts tomatoes to shame. Sweet potatoes naturally cure themselves. Once harvested and properly dried, they store for 4 to 6 months without refrigeration. No canning, no freezing, no electricity, just cool, dry air. Which means while tomatoes rot in days and force you into sauces and jars, sweet potatoes wait patiently until you need them. And that's real resilience. Now let's talk about production, because this is where tomatoes completely lose. One sweet potato plant can produce multiple pounds of food underground, while also feeding you above ground. And it does this in poor soil, in heat, in humidity, in conditions where tomatoes simply give up. Sweet potatoes don't need staking, don't need pruning, don't need sprays, and pests rarely destroy the entire crop because the plant spreads its growth across vines and nodes. Damage one part and the rest keeps going. Tomatoes, on the other hand, are single-stem divas. One disease and it's over. Now think about effort versus return. Tomatoes demand constant attention. Sweet potatoes thrive on neglect. And this is where year-round production becomes real. In warm climates, sweet potatoes never truly stop growing. You harvest selectively, leaving the root system intact. In cooler climates, you overwinter tubers and slips, indoors, and restart without buying seeds, which means you are no longer participating in the yearly seed economy. You are propagating your own food system. And that's the part that makes this plant dangerous to the industrial model. Because sweet potatoes don't need you to buy anything after. The first planting, they multiply themselves. Vines root wherever they touch soil. Slips grow from stored tubers. Abundance becomes automatic, and abundance breaks dependency. Nutritionally, this plant destroys tomatoes as well. Sweet potatoes provide complex carbohydrates, fiber, beta-carotene, potassium, vitamin C, and the leaves add protein, calcium, iron, and antioxidants. Tomatoes are mostly water and sugar by comparison. Useful, yes, but not sustaining. You can live on sweet potatoes and greens for long periods. You cannot do that on tomatoes. And this is why, historically, sweet potatoes sustained entire populations through famine, war, and economic collapse, while tomatoes were absent from survival diets. Now ask yourself why modern gardening culture doesn't frame it this way. Why beginner advice pushes tomatoes instead of perennial calorie crops. Why seed companies market novelty varieties instead of resilience. It's because a plant that feeds you year after year without replanting does not generate recurring profit. Tomatoes do. Now, imagine replacing half your tomato beds with sweet potatoes. Imagine harvesting greens weekly, digging tubers when you need calories, storing food without power, and replanting without buying seeds. That's not just gardening, that's independence. And independence is never aggressively promoted. Because once you experience a plant that works with you instead of against you, you start questioning the entire food system. And that's exactly why this plant stays in the background. Not illegal, not banned, just quietly ignored. Because suppression doesn't always look like prohibition. Sometimes it looks like distraction. Endless tomato videos, endless varieties, endless problems to solve. While the real workhorse grows silently in the corner, producing, storing, surviving. Now, if you're serious about food that actually delivers, not aesthetics, not hype, but real calories, real storage, real continuity, then the choice becomes obvious. Tomatoes are entertainment, sweet potatoes are infrastructure. And once you build infrastructure, you stop depending on systems that were never designed for your security in the first place. Because once you stop treating food like a seasonal hobby and start treating it like a system, everything changes. And this is where the sweet potato completely separates itself from tomatoes in ways most people never even think about. Because tomatoes train you to think in harvest events. You wait, you stress, you protect, you harvest all at once, and then it's over. But sweet potatoes train you to think in flow. Continuous input, continuous output. Leaves today, tubers later. Storage for months. Propagation built into the plant itself. And when a plant teaches you continuity instead of bursts, your mindset shifts from gardening to sovereignty. Now, let's talk about replanting. Because tomatoes force you into a loop, every year you start from zero. Seeds, seedlings, timing, weather risk, early blight, late blight, heat stress, end of season collapse, and then repeat. But sweet potatoes don't reset to zero. They compound. One harvest becomes the next planting. Vines become slips. Slips become plants. Plants become storage roots. Storage roots become next year's slips. It's a closed loop. And closed loops are the enemy of consumer dependency. because there is no external input required once the system is established. No seed catalog, no urgency, no seasonal panic, just continuity. And this matters even more when you consider storage behavior. Tomatoes punish you for abundance. Too many tomatoes means rot, waste, frantic processing, energy use, jars, lids, vinegar, salt, heat, time, and even then, shelf life is limited. Sweet potatoes reward abundance. More harvest simply means longer storage. No extra work, no equipment, no electricity. And this is why, historically, sweet potatoes were considered a strategic crop, not a culinary one. Armies didn't march on tomatoes. Civilizations didn't survive winters on tomatoes. But sweet potatoes quietly fed millions because they solved the two problems that actually matter: calories and time. And this brings us to labor efficiency. Tomatoes demand precision. Sweet potatoes tolerate chaos. Miss a watering with tomatoes and yields suffer. Miss a watering with sweet potatoes and they shrug. Poor soil ruins tomatoes. Poor soil barely slows sweet potatoes. Pests love tomatoes. Pests nibble sweet potatoes and move on. And when you zoom out, you start seeing tomatoes as a high-maintenance signal crop. Something that looks productive when conditions are perfect, but collapses under stress. While sweet potatoes are a resilience crop. Something that performs best when conditions are imperfect. And here's the part that really breaks the illusion. The reason tomatoes dominate modern gardening culture isn't because they're better. It's because they're visible. They fruit above ground. They ripen red. They photograph well. They give instant gratification. Sweet potatoes do their real work underground, invisible, quiet, patient. And modern culture hates anything that doesn't perform publicly. But food security has never been about aesthetics. It's about reliability. Now think about scalability. One tomato plant occupies space and gives one type of yield. One sweet potato plant spreads, covers soil, suppresses weeds, improves soil structure, reduces erosion, produces greens, produces tubers, and self-propagates. It's a multi-function organism. Tomatoes are single function, fruit or nothing. And this difference becomes massive when you scale from garden to land. Because sweet potatoes don't just feed you, they stabilize your growing environment. Their vines shade soil, retain moisture, and reduce weed pressure, meaning less work over time. Tomatoes increase work over time, trellising, pruning, spraying, replacing. And again, effort compounds in the wrong direction. And once you understand this, you realize why year-round production isn't about forcing tomatoes out of season in greenhouses with artificial inputs. It's about choosing plants whose biology already aligns with continuity. Sweet potatoes grow when heat is high, store when cold arrives, bridge seasons naturally, and don't fight the climate. They cooperate with it, and cooperation always beats control in the long run. Now imagine food prices doubling, supply chains stalling, seed availability becoming erratic, fertilizer costs rising. Suddenly tomatoes become a liability, but sweet potatoes become an asset because you're not exposed to timing risk, you're not exposed to seed risk, and you're not exposed to storage risk. And this is the quiet power of crops that never need replanting. They remove entire categories of uncertainty from your life. And uncertainty is what keeps people dependent, because when food feels fragile, people cling to systems that promise stability, even as those systems are expensive and extractive. But when your backyard produces reliable calories month after month, year after year, your psychological relationship with food changes. You stop fearing shortages, you stop hoarding, you stop reacting, and you start planning. And planning is what separates survival from control. Now let's talk about why this isn't common knowledge. Because if everyone replaced half their tomato growing with perennial calorie crops, demand patterns would change, seed sales would drop, seasonal urgency would soften, and gardening media would lose its endless cycle of problems to fix. Tomatoes generate content because they generate failure. Sweet potatoes generate silence because they generate success. And success doesn't keep people clicking. Now here's the final shift. The reason sweet potatoes outperform tomatoes isn't just biological, it's philosophical. Tomatoes represent annual thinking, reset thinking, dependency thinking, while sweet potatoes represent continuity thinking, compounding thinking, and once you build even one system like this into your life, it becomes a template. You start asking different questions. Which crops store longest? Which crops regrow themselves? Which crops reduce work over time instead of increasing it? And slowly, almost without noticing, you move from gardening as entertainment to gardening as infrastructure. And infrastructure is boring until you need it. But when you need it, it's everything. So if you've been wondering why your garden feels like work instead of security, why you're busy but not buffered, productive but not protected, the answer isn't more effort, it's better plant choices. Plants that produce year-round, store for months, and never ask you to start over. And once you experience that kind of stability, tomatoes stop being the star of the show. They become what they always should have been, a supplement, not a foundation. Because foundations don't rot in days. Foundations don't reset every season. Foundations persist, compound, and quietly keep you fed while the rest of the world argues about prices, shortages, and supply chains. And that's why this plant matters. Not because it's trendy, not because it's exotic, but because it works, even when everything else doesn't.